Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, this tech forum session. We're going to get started now. So thank you for joining us. I'm Ainsley Sparks, the Communications and Marketing Manager at BookNet Canada. Welcome to the first session of Humane Resources, Managing Your People Systems with No HR Department. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that BookNet Canada acknowledges its staff, board, and partners work upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron Indigenous peoples, the original nations of this land. BookNet Canada endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. So now let me introduce Jeanne LeSage. Jeanne is an arts consultant with a 30-plus year career, starting as a theater stage manager, working for 10 years at the Toronto International Film Festival in theater operations and human resources, 6 years in international arts project, including the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Abu Dhabi Film Festival, and the Royal Opera House Muscat in Oman. Jeanne is a certified human resources leader, holds an MBA in management consulting, and owns and operates LeSage Arts Management in Toronto with a focus on human resources, organizational effectiveness, strategy, and facilitation. Jeanne is a sought-after speaker and trainer, having delivered sessions on strategic human resources, such as organizational development and effectiveness, performance management, policy development, workplace harassment and respectful workplaces, and more. Jeanne is a proud volunteer board member for nonprofits Volcano Theatre, Department of Imaginary Affairs, and Stage Managing the Arts. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Jeanne.
Great. Thank you, Ainsley. So overview. Again, today is going to be very foundational in terms of HR. We're going to talk a little bit about the context of the challenges in your sector when it comes to HR. We're going to do an HR framework context, and also knowing that, most folks on this call, my understanding is that folks do not have HR staff members or an HR resource. So it's really, how do we do HR without an HR department? And I'm going to break down the HR framework context into the need to know and the nice to know. We're then going to talk a little bit about people systems during COVID, because this is obviously what we are living right now. And we'll have a chance for a Q&A. And there'll be a little homework for you, very little homework. But the richness of these kinds of discussions and sessions is if we bring forward scenarios that are really specific to your experience and your needs. So just, I'm going to ask you to do a couple things, but it's just to kind of give some scenarios so that we can focus next week's session on really cracking into really specific application of what we're talking about. And then next week, we're going to have a deeper discussion. We're going to look at if there's any questions that we don't hit up today. We'll make sure we'll start the parking lot. So we'll do that. We'll talk a little bit more about the COVID piece, about what is it like to lead people right now in uncertain times. And we're also going to talk about respectful workplaces and workplace harassment, and then discussion groups on management scenarios. So just to give you a sense of the overview. Now, I also just need to do our, the caveat. I'm giving you informational data. This is not legal advice. This is not HR advice. Understanding when you need to reach out to that resource is very, very important. Each organization's got its own needs. And also areas of compliance are going to be governed by your applicable provincial, territorial, and in some cases, federal jurisdiction. So please know that, take this information and then really understand how you need to apply it to the specifics of your organization. All right, so Aline, my poll master, can we start the first poll? So we're just looking for where folks are from. This is very helpful for me to know. Okay, so it's BC, Manitoba, Ontario. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And next one. Are you a nonprofit? Okay. Gotcha. So six have a board of directors and the others no. And the reason I asked that is because obviously when we start to get into HR challenges and leadership, understanding if you have a board of directors is a completely different paradigm than if you don't. So that's helpful. Thank you. Next poll, please. How many staff? So if we're talking about full-time and FTE, so mostly 2 to 10. Well, we've got 11 to 20, and then some larger one is at 51 plus, 31 to 40, one person operation. Okay, great. So the majority of folks on this call, lots of folks in that 2 to 10 range, and then 11 to 20, but we've also got some with larger. Very helpful, thank you. All right. Do you have an HR staff person? So meaning, you might have somebody, probably most of you are the HR staff person as well as the marketing person and the resource person and programming and operations. So do you have a staff person? Yeah, pretty much. Not surprised to see this. Yep. Okay, we've got 3 that have yes, that's great. And you'll see I said somebody whose role is at least 50% HR related. Okay, that's helpful. And whoops, oh. How many staff do you directly supervise? So do you directly supervise staff? 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. Wow. Direct reports of 11 to 15 folks. That's a lot of people. 6 to 10, 1 to 5. Okay, super helpful. Yeah, so for a lot of the folks on the call, it's like you supervise 1 to 5. Also the person who doesn't supervise staff, might mean that's a one-person shop. So you may wish that you were supervised staff because it meant you had staff. But I see some 6 to 10, 11, 15. That's a lot of people. And our last one. Does your organization have any unions, guilds, or associations? And actually, could you also write in the chat box who those unions, guilds, and associations might be? I'm trying to get my chat box up. There we go. Okay, so just a couple that have unions, guilds, or associations representing your staff or authors. Okay, great. Okay. So first, just to step back a little bit, and as you saw from my bio, I do come more from performing arts, from theater festivals, film festivals. And so when I was chatting with the BookNet folks, I wanted to really make sure that I understood the specifics for your sector, because HR, in some cases, HR challenges are HR challenges, but I think we all know the specifics of our sector. They're going to be very, very different challenges. So the BookNet folks kindly directed me to some existing research, and also we pulled together and chatted with some folks to kind of look a little bit anecdotally about what are the kinds of challenges that are happening in your sector. So I'm sure many of you saw this, but the Quill and Choir did a workplace survey, and they did it in February 2020, just pre-pandemic. So, and it said it was the first annual. I do hope they continue to do it, because seeing baseline changes can be helpful. This was an anonymous online survey pre-pandemic and focusing on the health of the workplace. Now, the respondents was 172. You can decide whether or not that's a pool that's enough to kind of look at some stats, but I think it's good to even start asking these questions. So what were some of their key findings? So 51% of the respondents said their workplace had no HR representative, and many didn't know who to turn to for HR. And that last part is also just as important. So if there's an HR issue, who do you turn to? 53% of respondents have reported experiencing forms of harassment. And we're going to chat tomorrow about respectful workplaces and looking at some ways, again, for these small organizations to put in place the kinds of programs and systems to acknowledge that. And the same theme here again. Many didn't know who to turn to if there was an issue about harassment. 42% said they are intending to seek new employment this year. Now, obviously that will change just in the midst of the pandemic, but that's, 42% saying that they're looking for new work. That's a challenging stat. 66% would recommend their company to others as a good place to work. I will say, when I read the Quill and Choir, they said only 66% recommended that. And I actually think it's not a bad number. So even if somebody's looking for new employment, they might recommend that their place is a good place to work. 41% of employees needed side gigs to make ends meet. And this is something we also commonly see in performing arts as well, and in visual arts, museums, heritage, that employees, even they will always may always need an alternative forms of employment to make ends meet. What else? So just some more results, and this graphic is from the Quill and Choir report. Now, on the good side, because I want us to also talk about the great things that are happening. The majority enjoy positive relationships with immediate bosses and receive support for their health and ability issues. This is amazing. When you look at studies and statistics about employee retention and employee engagement, the relationship with their manager is one of the key drivers for why people are happy at their jobs. So this is good news. So what it might mean is that, and I can't, it's hard to interpret all the data, but what it might mean is that there might be some other structural things that are contributing to that folks looking for other work and making ends meet. But a positive relation, I just wanted to highlight this because this is really good news. And Sylvia shared, yeah, oh, that's great, Sylvia. So Sylvia's sharing a nationwide survey on diversity, inclusion, and equity for the magazine industry. Results in July. Fantastic. That's great, Sylvia. Thank you. More findings. Now, 65% feel they receive non-monetary recognition for their work. So praise and thank yous. Also incredibly important. Now, back to some of the bigger challenges, 26.5% of respondents felt that they typically feel tense or stressed during the workday. And you see in the graphic, when you sort of talk about what are the main work stressors, it's heavy workload, low salary, high expectations, feeling stuck. So those are the kinds of things to look at. Now, again, you can decide how you apply this data. Does this apply to your workplace and your constituents? But I think it's good to kind of look at this as a bit of a starting framework. And some additional challenges that we chatted about, anecdotally was, for leaders as well, if individuals may say it's a challenge if they don't have an HR person to go to, I say it's a bigger challenge for leaders. It means that you are taking care of that HR function along with your 99 other portfolios. And there's no time for leadership to attend to HR challenges. And I think folks on this call would agree, if you've had to experience this, if there's a challenge in HR, it will take up a lot of your time. It takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room because the people side is complex. And another big challenge, what we heard from sector folks, was that employee retention is a really big challenge. There's a revolving door of staff. They might only stay for 12, 19 months. And that continual recruiting and hiring and training and onboarding, and also that loss of the corporate memory going out the door can be a real challenge for organizations. And also when you've got those small organizations, there can be a sense for the individuals that there's lack of room for advancement, meaning there's not a clear path with lots of vacancies where I can move from being an assistant to a coordinator and a manager. And so what does that do for the individual? There was also a discussion about a difference in intergenerational communication styles and work styles. And what does that mean in a workplace? And I would say with COVID, that has also made things, that has really highlighted things as well. COVID-related challenges, and we're going to talk specifically about that today. We've got new work structures, overnight remote workplaces, managing health and wellness. And then of course, broad sector challenges. So unionization, and what does that mean for the sector, and what does that mean for your organization? And of course, inclusion and accessibility and in career advancement for marginalized groups. And also I would say, what are those inclusion practices after hiring? So how do you retain and set up folks for success? So what else for you? So I'm going to pause because that was a lot of wah from me. In the chat, what are your major issues? And you can private chat me as well if you'd rather stay anonymous. What are your biggest HR challenges? About to hire a part-time position. Want to know what needs to be set up to be inclusive. Okay, great, Sylvia. So looking at so you've not had to hire a part-time position before. So what do you need to do to set up to be inclusive? Okay, great. Deductions, okay. So things like the payroll employee piece, okay. Losing the in-person environment, idea exchange, taking the temperature of how people are doing, et cetera. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And I think when we chat about when we look at the COVID piece later on in today's session, we've had some good conversations about that, about how do you do the communication to get the work done, and also to have that social connectedness, but also that normal, let's talk about this ideas and let's cook on something, that sort of standing in the hallway and looking at an idea. Providing feedback, especially when there are issues, 100%, Andrew. So looking at if you need to give your employee feedback, sometimes this Zoom this interface that we have set up about being on camera, it might create an environment which is a little bit different from sort of popping over the desk and having a chat. To support and not overload staff. Yep. Reasonable expectations. Yep. We're going to chat about that in the COVID section today. Onboarding new staff successfully in a virtual workplace, 100%. And in some cases, we're hiring people and we may not have met them. Yes. We might need to do the entire recruitment process without having met them, and now you're onboarding them. And I think we all know that in HR terms, we call it the organizational culture, which is that kind of, connective tissue about how you work, and this is what happens in the coffee room, and we do that, and here's the other kind of social pieces that happen. These are all really great. Dawn, Scott. Misunderstandings from depending on written communication more in the past. Yeah, 100% Scott. And I think folks have very different communication styles, and things in writing can be misunderstood, and really kind of looking at how we communicate. And Dawn, so Dawn's echoing that as well. Finding effective and efficient communication strategies that work for everyone. And I see a lot of like +1s on Dawn. So yeah, this is what's interesting, Dawn, and also building on what Scott's saying is the challenge is, you need to find different kinds of communication styles for different folks. And so, and this is where I can deliver these sessions, and at the end of it, Dee like, Jeanne, the weird HR lady, just now added about 1 million hours of time to my portfolio, and I'm already really busy. But I think it's good to kind of think about this in an aspirational way, and some things to work towards, and see if we can look at how to do that. I think you need to look at different kinds of communication styles, and because some folks might be super, and we'll talk about this in the COVID section, but some folks are working from home, great. And being on Zoom, great. And it's not going to work for everyone. And everybody's got very, very different situations. I'm going to do a couple more, and then I'm going to roll on. We have a great one that's come in. What can staff do if they have a complaint about management, but no HR to go to other than the management themselves? And that's a great, thank you for that. That was a direct message that came to me. That's a great question. And we'll chat about that a little bit more on next week, but it's a great question. Onboarding while everyone is working remotely, and everyone now knows my cat, Sylvia. Yes, my cats are more famous than I am right now. So, and never did I thought I'd be such a cat lady publicly, but this is where it is. All right, so great. Thank you all. That's fantastic. I'm going to roll on. I'm just going to watch our time. HR framework. So what I want to do is just step back. Now, I know you are all leaders, so you are running, in some cases we saw one person shop, you might have 10, 20, more. So some of what I'm going to talk about is going to be a little bit, okay, this is Captain Obvious HR lady, but I want to walk through it because I want to really talk about where HR fits in to the context of things. So HR management is the function that focuses on recruitment, management, and providing direction for the people who work in the organization, right? Captain Obvious. But what does that mean? And we often hear the word HR. I always want to rebrand human resources. I mean, I fell into HR working at TIFF. I was the stage manager that they sent to HR school to set up the HR department. So we can think about HR as this is an extra task. It's an add-on to my real job. Managing people should just be common sense. You just do it, make sure people don't know what to do. And I don't need training on this. We don't have the budget to deal with any of these issues. My company only has 3 staff. Why do I need to worry about this? And HR is, there's a lot of people that think that HR is just like the department of saying no to things. So what I like to really talk about is how does HR fit into your strategies? So why should we worry about HR? I mean, I'm probably speaking to the converted because you're all here giving me 2 hours of your time. And if you're in Ontario, it's a sunny day, finally. So part of growing any business or organization or maintaining a business organization is going to include adding staff. It's a reality. And we know that in your sector, there's competing resources and budget. We have to make our budgets go a really long way. So when you have a hire, you really need that to work and be effective. And when I saw that one of the main challenges was about retention, and that you might be changing over staff every 12, 18 months, that is a huge drain on on your organization's operations. Rigor and discipline. And I will say, I think, and I don't, we've been hearing the words from funders, and I'm not sure if it's in the same landscape of the funders that you're working with. And I notice there's a number that are not nonprofit, so it might be a different landscape. But I know from funders, they're looking for more rigor and discipline from organizations, and they use the word that not everybody in the sector loves to hear. They love to sort of use the word the professionalization of certain functions. So they want to see more rigor in certain pieces. Whereas in the past, it might be, maybe we have policies, maybe we do, maybe we're not sure what's happening. Now there's a call for a rigor and discipline when it comes to these things. I think also this is a collaborative sector, and there's a whole notion that the work that we do is very collaborative based, team based. And I think now with COVID, with the challenges of COVID, the people side of it is now incredibly important to take care of. So HR doesn't need to be punitive, bureaucratic, or blocking. You may not be able to afford a separate HR department. I'm not going to stand here and say you need to hire an HR person. It's going to be what you need it to be. But you need to have HR policies articulated and available to employees. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we sort of break down what I keep calling the need to know and the nice to know. In an org context, just I'll be super brief about this. I think it's good to, again, for me, because I grew up in HR from the point of view of the needs of the business, and then HR is one of those strategies, I like to remind ourselves that HR isn't a standalone function. It should be part of that big picture. So in your organization, if you have can be in a nonprofit or a private organization, you have a vision and mission and values of how you work and what you want to do overall. And then you have organizational goals for the year. And then you might have departmental work plans, and then individual tasks and action plans. So that HR piece, I want you to really think about how HR fits into your org strategy. And this can often come up as like, well, here's the 10 things that you need to be doing in HR. Well, I say, what does your organization need? If your goals and priorities for the year are of a certain nature, then your HR strategies need to match that. Your marketing plans match your org strategy, your programming plans, your operational plans. So should your people plans. So the cycle. It might seem very simple to talk about this, but if we think about HR through the cycle of a hire. So what's the plan? Who do you need? What do you need that job to be doing? What are their skills and attributes? How do you choose them? How are you going about that recruitment? What are you going to offer them? How are you going to bring them on? How are you going to onboard them and train them? And then how do you support them when they're there? And we can look at, there's lots of different aspects of that. So how do we reward them? How should we pay them? How do I keep my best people? Do we need policies, performance reviews, et cetera? So if Jeanne, the HR lady, is adding a million things to your to-do list, the question is, do I really need to do all of these things? And I'm going to give you the consultant response, which is, it depends. And you'll hear me repeat this because I think it bears repeating. Your HR processes should be specific to your organization, your size, your location, the nature of your work, and also what are the specific strategic priorities for your org. So again, we're going to talk about the need to know and the nice to know. And really, I try to break this down so that especially organizations in different size, it can be very overwhelming to look at, well, here's the 99 things I'm not doing in HR. And I know many of you probably may already have these formal processes in place, or you do it all informally and intuitively because it's part of the 99 things in your portfolio. So what I'm trying to do is like really kind of look at, if you need to sit down and proactively think about HR systems in your organization, how do you do it? And the need to know is really kind of getting at what's the baseline of what you should be thinking about as an employer. So what are your statutory and legal considerations? It might be called compliance, it might be called legal side of things, but you are an employer. And the tough message is, even with small organizations, is if you are an employer employing people, then you do have obligations. And it can be a tough message for me to deliver if it's a small org with the one-person shop or the two-person shop and you're working very, very hard. But the fact is once you employ people, you have some obligations. So what are these? So when we think about the legal and statutory, again, I go back to something I said at the beginning, which is you need to remember that each province and territory will have applicable legislation for each jurisdiction, and some orgs are federally regulated. So I'm going to walk you through some examples with the Ontario context, but you need to kind of find your local. And we've got 3 provinces in play here. We've got Ontario, BC, and Manitoba, and we may have had some folks join since. But please always remember, because the legislation can be quite different in each province and territory. Okay, so back to this need to know. Why is it important that we really kind of look at this baseline compliance? Oh, and clearly my smarter, I was getting a little fancy with my graphics here. Fancies and being arguable. Why is it important to stay on top of statutory and legal considerations in HR need to know? Do you want to throw some ideas in chats? Why do you think we need to keep on top of statutory and legal considerations? Risk mitigation? Yeah, 100%. Risk mitigation. Any other thoughts about why we want to stay on top of statutory and legal? Treating people fairly, 100%. Absolutely. Compliance and liability. So under the risk mitigation, again, I get to deliver all the scaring the crap out of folks. Such a sunshiny personality, Jeanne, the HR lady. Compliance and liability. Failure to understand an employer's obligation under the statutory legislation could lead to serious repercussions, including fines and legal actions. It really is important in your risk mitigation. And I think, I remember, and again, I'm going to use forgive the theater context, but when I started out 25, 30 years ago, deployment standards, hours of work, it doesn't apply to us. Like we're a small organization. It doesn't matter. We're going to, and those days are over. Like I think we're seeing more and more that folks are being held to account to make sure that they are being held accountable. So really that compliance and liability is very important. And for those that answered that you have nonprofit boards, I think, I'm sure you're being faced with, your boards are probably asking for this level of risk mitigation as well, since boards of directors are technically liable. So they're starting to realize that they need to understand the level of obligations and what's being put forward, and making sure that the organization's doing what they should be doing. Your ethical duty. So back to sort of what Sylvia was saying. Oh, Scott, thank you. So for-profit boards are represented here too. Thank you. Okay, yeah, great. Thank you for that. So probably similar thing, Scott, where those for-profit boards, same thing. They're going to be looking for that level of accountability because of making sure that the organization's doing what they should be doing. So Sylvia mentioned this, talking about treating people fairly. So I think if we talk about this baseline level of compliance and liability, I think we have an ethical duty. This is the right thing to do. So yeah, Scott, sticklers. Yeah. I hear you, Scott. Yeah, absolutely. Your ethical duty, it's the right thing to do. Taking care of your staff and understanding staff rights and employers' obligations. Where's my look? And, when we look at employment laws, again, it can be hard for small organizations because it can feel like it's very hard to kind of even to figure out what are the thresholds of what you need to be doing, and then how do you deliver those and adhere to those when you don't have the kind of time and budget and resources. But the employment laws are there to ensure that a workplace is safe, fair, and inclusive. So there's some good measure in there. Okay, so what are the kinds of legal considerations we're going to talk about? Just doing a time check. Okay, great. First of all, again, in your province or territory, there's the Employment Standards Act of Ontario. So the ESA, and typically the ESA and each of your jurisdictions will have this. And I will find the folks that are BC, I find the guidelines and info sheets for the BC Minister of Labor far easier to read than Ontario. And in Manitoba, apologies, I'm not as aware of the Manitoba pieces. So the employment standards tends to be, and I should keep in mind, this is going to be for your employees, not your independent contractors. Important distinction if you have employees versus independent contractors. Now, when it comes to employment standards, typically that applies to your employees, and could be hours of work and overtime, can be leaves, vacation policies, termination, severance notices, and any number of things. And leaves right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the COVID piece. Leaves not right now are particularly challenging to look at because there's such a dimension now of the kinds of leaves that we're looking at because of COVID. The Labor Relations Act. Now, I didn't, there was two that mentioned that they've got either a guild or a union or association. So this probably wouldn't impact this group as much, but the Labor Relations Act would apply to registered unions. There are a number of guilds and associations that represent individuals. They may not necessarily be registered unions. So, but if you do have a registered union, then you need to keep in mind about the Labor Relations Act for your jurisdiction. Now, health and safety. So in Ontario, the OSA, this, and again, it's going to be different in different provinces, but the health and safety body covers, WSIB, which is version of workers' comp, insurance, joint health and safety committee. So your need to have health and safety policies, depending on the size of your organization. So do you need a health and safety committee, or do you just need a rep? Do you need a policy? And I'd say in the last 10 to 13 years, workplace harassment, violence in the workplace has now come in with in health and safety as well as human rights. So looking at what are the needs, again, for your organization in your jurisdiction under health and safety. And of course, the Human Rights Code, which is the code that prevents discrimination against certain grounds, which the grounds are different in every province, against certain social areas. And also, specific in Ontario, and this, especially if you've got a venue, and I know I'd probably for this group, you might have a bookshop, so you might have a public facing venue, but probably not as much for this group. But the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, but that could apply to your offices, stores, shops, etc. And then the Pay Equity Act and the new COVID related laws. And when we talk about COVID specific, we'll chat about this a little bit in detail, but just spoiler alert, my message to you is that this is a fast moving target right now, and it's changing quite a bit. So my advice to folks is to key into your local jurisdiction, and I'll give you some examples of some places to look for the ongoing changes, because there was actually something that just came out 3 or 4 days ago, which we're going to mention a little bit later on, which is about the new sick leave provisions. And then, of course, there's something you may have heard, this common law and case law, which is that'll come about when you're in employment agreements and in terminations. So again, remember, you need to look at both your province territorial jurisdiction and also thresholds for the size of your organization. So for example, health and safety, they have thresholds according to number of employees about whether or not you need a health and safety rep or you need a full committee, XYZ. All right, so the COVID legislation, again, it's changing fast. So we'll look at ways, my suggestions to you about how to source this locally so that you can stay on top of what is happening with COVID. Okay, so what does this mean? So if I'm talking about, again, this is the need to know, what are the practical applications for all of those jurisdictions that I talked to you about? So policy manuals, policy statements. So some organizations will have clear policy manuals. They might have statements. So the policy manual could be, the employment, for employees, employment standards is a minimum, and some organizations will decide to offer more. So for example, ESA will say X amount of vacation days. You may decide that you're going to offer more as a way to attract more folks and to kind of create a workplace that, supports people taking time off. We've also seen codes of conduct, respectful workplace. So we've seen a number of different policy manual statements, all that coming into play. And those, you need to kind of make sure that you're kind of covering your bases with that previous list I showed you. Those are the layers of legislation that you need to think about. And now here, what I'm talking about is the application of them in your workplace. Employment contract templates. Now, policy manuals and employment contract templates, I know in different organizations, some folks they may have had a one-pager offer. Sometimes you have a 15, 20-page employment agreement and anything in between. Remember that your employment contract templates, it's a really good idea to have a good look at those, but your policy manuals are as important because together they become that, that rules of the road and that agreement that you have made with your employees about how's everything going to work. What are the rules? What are the guardrails, if you like? And, the policy manual employment contract, sometimes the employment contract will say, and please refer to the policy manual for the governing rules, and the policy manual might reflect back to the employment contract. So you just need to kind of have a think about how they all talk to each other, because together they provide that roadmap for your staff to kind of understand what are those policy pieces. And again, something I'll repeat is about that ESA is the minimum. You can decide to do more, but you just want to be clear about it and have it in writing and know how you're going to carry that out. Sylvia's got a question. Would you recommend templates policies for volunteers, unpaid practicum students, etc.? Yes, 100%, Sylvia. And when it comes to, how I was saying before, ESA's employees, health and safety, and I want to be careful because I don't want to say the wrong thing because in different provincial jurisdictions, but in health and safety, when they in Ontario, and there's Jeanne LeSage is a really great health and safety event consultant here in Ontario. And in the health and safety legislation, the definition of worker arguably is a lot broader. So it can be an employee, it can be a contractor, it can be a volunteer, which includes your board. So for the nonprofit board. So I say if you've got, and forgive the term worker, but that's often the term that's used, especially in health and safety parlance. If you've got workers working, I think it's really good and important to kind of have similar policies that govern their involvement with you. It may not be as detailed as your employee ones, but if they're doing work with you, I think it's really good to have those kinds of templates. So when it comes to volunteers, it's okay to ask them to sign an agreement before they start to volunteer with you. Now, you may not do that all the time if somebody's there. Depends on the work that the volunteer work that you do with them. When I oversaw HR and volunteers at TIFF, and of course TIFF was 2,000 volunteers at the time. It's even more now. But we started to put in place a volunteer manual as well as a one-page agreement, and it actually was great because it allowed for us to say what we expected from them, because with 2,000 volunteers, you might need to discipline a volunteer and you might need to remove a volunteer. And that might seem counter to like, well, I'm volunteering, but you need to kind of really approach it in the same way. It also meant that we could share with the volunteers, here's also what we commit to you. We commit that you will be protected under our policies. So for example, in our respectful workplace policy, often you look at the scope of that is for your employees, your contractors, as well as your volunteers. So it's a great question. Barbara has a question about standard templates. I'll put that in the parking lot. It gets a bit tricky because I'm a big fan. So sorry, I didn't read out the whole question. So Barbara said, are there standard templates we can access? Let me look at that. I'll put that in the parking lot for next time. My concern, Barbara, I'm a fan of templates, but you need to make them your own. And really the context for what you need it for is super important to kind of look at that. I'm a big fan of sharing and best practices, but you need to customize them for yourself. And there's so many different examples. And I think and Barbara, if you're sort of thinking about templates for contract or maybe for a policy manual, there's such a wide variance. But we have a section where we're going to talk a little bit about what are the strategies about how you can put this in place within an HR department. So maybe we can come back to that. Okay, so what else are okay, thanks, Barbara, contracts. Awesome. So practical applications. So employment contract templates, independent contractor contract templates, and also understanding that notion of when can somebody be an employee and when can they be an independent contractor. When it comes to policy examples, again, this is back for your employees. I think we've seen anybody that's sort of, seen versions of these. It can be anything from vacation, overtime, lieu time, which is a very tricky conversation, respect in the workplace, which can cover harassment, discrimination, and workplace violence, health and safety policies, accessibility, an employee manual, which might be more also guidelines and not always policy. So that employee manual might be part of that. I mean, it's interesting now since we're completely remote, and the conversation came up about how do we onboard employees when we're not in the office. And so maybe that employee manual, which is not policy, but it's kind of like, here's where we store our files and we have a weekly meeting and here's when we come together. It's that, how do we work? I think with back to the policy too, it's really good to kind of talk about, here's how we approach leaves, here's how we approach sick time. And I say, again, you may not be able to sit down and write everything, but if you have I keep bringing up the word guardrails. If you have a policy or the way that you do things, articulating it in writing and being really clear about it, and then making sure that you are implementing it fairly and consistently is really important. Sylvia, that's a great question. Let's park that. Health and safety, including ergonomics for home office. Great topic. We'll talk about that in the COVID section. Employment lawyer. Just one last thing I want to say about this is, you know, I know with small organizations and small budgets, you know, you can't always go out and hire an employment lawyer, and you can't always go out and hire an HR consultant or expert. And I'm not advocating that you always need to find that external resource, but there are moments in time. And, you know, if anybody on this call has ever had some sticky situations, there's an art to knowing when it's time to reach out to external expertise. If there's a complication that's coming up, if it's involving something that could escalate and might have some more risk implications, it's good to kind of know when you're able to seek some qualified legal assistance. Now, the nice to know, the extended piece, and a lot of next week's is going to be talking about specifically about managing people. So I'm not going to talk a ton about this, but that first base, like, need to know, again, that's that really dealing with the baseline compliance and legal side. Now, what about the ongoing people side, the extended HR? And this is where, when I was saying your HR policies need to kind of match what your org needs, in this section now I find really, if you're going to do some more extended HR pieces, it's really about what your org needs. So what are the kinds of extended HR pieces that can happen? So HR strategy or HR planning. You know, organizations that are smaller, you probably do this intuitively. Well, we've got this project, we're going to have to ramp up, we're going to need to add more staff, it's for a short period of time, or, you know, so you do that already on the side of your desk. What you might look at is, like, do you have any major change in your current or future staffing needs? Do you need to look at major change initiatives in your HR migration? I've seen this if an org has done a major business change where they've gone, maybe they've secured a building and now you're running a venue. That changes what your business is like, and now that changes what your people strategy should be. And of course, with COVID, there's been the other side of very reactive HR planning. For a lot of folks, it's been very, very tough. They've had to really lean down, and they might have had to have done temporary layoffs and terminations and reduction. Like, a lot of that has been happening really quickly. Click. EDI work, I want to just mention, you know, it can, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion work, accessibility work. I'm including this here in this list about extended HR topics, but I want to be really clear that I think EDI is work that actually needs to be at the top of that pyramid, that the EDI work should be embedded in those strategies, embedded in the work of the organization as a framework for all of the work that happens. Often it might sit in this HR realm. I'd actually vote for it to kind of go up a level. Recruitment and selection might be an extended HR piece. So how are you managing how you're recruiting them and selecting them? Compensation and benefits, especially if you're not always able to give higher salaries. Are you able to kind of look at things like benefits? Are you able to look at the kinds of policies that might attract more staff? And especially to address that turnover piece. Training and development. Do we actually really have time? Sometimes we barely have time to train them in their new job, but also, can we look at the development that is more forward-looking? Training really looks at training them in their current job. Development is thinking about giving them professional development training for the future. And lots of folks might say, well, you know, if I train them for another job, they'll just leave. They'll just leave and go to another organization. And that's a bit of a conundrum. You can say, well, I don't want to pay them because then they'll leave and another org will get the benefit of that. But if you don't pay them, then they probably will leave or they'll stay. And you haven't trained them. So I think like looking at, especially the challenge that came up, talking about if there's not like a systemic advancement, like if I'm an assistant, there's no coordinator or manager roles to move into, training and development can be a way to kind of keep people engaged and happy. And performance and career management. So performance management, the dreaded performance review, looking at how do you give feedback, and also informally and also formally, how do you do those performance reviews and performance evaluation. And a very important bucket, again, one of these things you're already doing, I'm going to call it employee relations. There's a lot of work on organizational culture, again, that connective tissue about how we work. How do you deal with dispute resolutions? If you're lucky enough to have an employee assistance program, or an employee wellness program, what are the other kinds of things that you're doing on employee relations side? And then for the folks that have unions. So I'm going to keep rolling because I'm conscious that I'm going to do a couple more things and then we'll take a little bit of a bio break. So don't be alarmed by this long list of HR topics. In a large organization, there could be an HR department for each of those functions. But again, I say choose some of those extended functions according to what you need. So if you are going to be ramping up something and you need to do a hiring boost, then recruitment and selection is something you need to work on. If you want to really look at retention and look at how can we find ways to look at our current staff and keep everybody really engaged and happy, you might look at an organizational culture project, or you might be looking at training and development. If you really need to kind of look at your performance management because your sense is that things are going okay, but really need to look at communication and how folks are doing, you might look at your performance management program. How do we do this with no budget? So HR without resources. So the first thing is I often ask, and when I start to work with new organizations, I ask, who's going to own this? Who's really going to own the HR portfolio? And it might be the leader. It might be the executive director. It might be, I saw some folks that, have staff of 10, 20. There might be a staff member that's got the capacity and the aptitude for HR, but I think it's really important to be clear about who holds this portfolio. And really great question came before, which is how do you give feedback if the ED is the person who is the HR lead? And that absolutely is a challenge. The trick is, you could have a junior staff member kind of be in charge of HR, but they may not have the experience in order to and they may not have the HR training, and also that training that we know that real essence of dealing with people and navigating all those people issues. So who's going to own it? And is there a way to develop some capacity within your organization? For those that have boards, do you seek to have a board member with HR expertise? And that can be invaluable to help out some of these frameworks. And also if something comes up, you've got somebody with experience that knows how to respond and react to some more of the challenging HR expertise. I would say, also, it's same thing like folks say, well, get a lawyer on your board. I mean, you often find a lawyer with the kind of, you would probably look at lawyers with IP experience or contract experience. Same thing with HR expertise. Find somebody with the kind of HR expertise that would match what you need. Maybe you have a working group on your board or a subcommittee. Look to art service organizations, of which a lot of you are art service organization, but as well, there's some art service organizations who've sought to kind of build this capacity and look at that. Take an HR course. Is there a way for, now again, it's like the eternal generalists, I'm asking you need to be experts in marketing, programming, operations. But for some folks, take a basic HR course, or maybe if there's that staff member that you've identified that could have the capacity and aptitude. I will say I was the stage manager at TIFF and they kind of went, do you want to work on this? And it was something I had never even thought about. And I dipped my toes in, took some courses and kind of went, oh, this is actually pretty good crossover for somebody with my experience. Stage management HR is actually not too far away. I'm not sure what the equivalent might be in your sector, but looking at, is there somebody that you could develop or yourself to take an HR course? Group with like peers to pool and share tools and resources. So there might be, if there might be 4 or 5 of you that are like, you know what, we can work on a policy manual because we have similar organizations. You know, it's not, you're not going to work on HR with each other because there's a certain amount of HR that's confidential, especially dealing with specifics of employees. But if you need to sit down and work on a policy manual, maybe you kind of, you know, crowd share information. 4 or 5 of you come together to work on a base, and you get some examples to work on it, and then you customize it for your own. But you must customize it on your own. When I really kind of sit down and work on performance management, what I don't want to hear is we don't talk about things and then we have the dreaded performance review meeting once a year. I'm being ridiculous and at the end of the continuum, but where you don't give feedback and you don't talk about management performance until you sit down and do that review. And then it's all a big surprise, and it can be a conversation dealing with conflict, as opposed to let's really talk about the work that needs to get done. Building a culture of feedback and doing it more and more is great. Another question, would it be appropriate to ask the president or other member of the board to act as the contact? Yes, 100%. So what Sylvia's suggesting is, if there's, you know, if this happens, the model happens in workplace harassment policies, so that often you need to be really clear in a harassment policy. If there's an issue, you report it to person X, which is usually the ED. And then you need to provide an alternate person if the issue involves the ED. And it needs to be out of that reporting line. So in the case when you do have a board, it would go up to, say, a board chair, or if you had an HR committee. Now, you want to be clear about when they should be contacting, because I think you don't want your board getting involved in the day-to-day. You know, with boards, one of the things you hear is about noses in and fingers out. So you want to make sure they're not going to go to that board representative for really minor things that could be dealt with, but you do want, it's like a whistleblowing alternative, so that if there's something happening with the ED, they've got an alternative. Committees, yeah. So somebody has mentioned that bringing on committees. Yeah, I think committees are great. And again, those committees can be also an alternate form of contact. Okay. So I realized that was a lot of information that I just plotzed at you. Plotzed is a technical term in HR. So I want to switch gears because I think obviously this is the world we're living in now, which is the managing the people systems in the midst of COVID. Okay, so I want to take some time just to step back and talk about how we deal with the people systems in the midst of the pandemic. And with a shout out to some colleagues, some HR colleagues that we worked on this. I was one of the co-creators for a initiative called Lean Arts, which was pro bono grassroots, pairing arts organizations with pro bono consultants. We ran it for 6 months from March to October to look at ways to kind of get really fast help with folks. And we created an HR subgroup and looked at some very specific HR pieces when it relates to pandemic. And this is ever changing and ever growing. So this is where I'm really open for us to chatting about this together, to kind of go, that's not what our experience is, or here's what's happening to us. And it's changing all of the time. So even grappling with what is the human dimension of when you've got staff, and when I say staff, again, it might be that broader term of your team. So if it's employees, contractors, volunteers. So we like to talk about it in a couple of different ways, just to even start the conversation, because there's so much to talk about when it comes to the people side during the pandemic. So first, there's the specific complex legal and personnel issues. We know, and everybody's been in different modes of it, or some people may not have had to deal with this. We've also just, we have to get work done, and we're getting work done in a new reality. Then, of course, there's the employee wellness, which includes physical wellness as well as mental health, and the long-range consequence of COVID on our people systems, which is something that I'd like to chat about. So first, let's talk about the specific complex legal and personnel issues. And it's tough for me to, it's really tough to kind of go A to Z, here's all the legal side of things, because it's going to be completely different for your organization. I've been involved with creating and creating webinars for different sector pieces where bringing in an employment lawyer to talk about how do you deal with all of the issues. But what is the realm? So let's just even think about what's the legal side of personnel. So health and safety. So obviously, as I mentioned, one of our obligations is to look at the health and safety of our workers. Now, folks here we've got some folks from Manitoba, from BC, as well as Ontario. We all know everybody is in a different public health state. So for some folks, it's actually been pretty simple because it's just been like, it's a stay at home. No offices are open, no bookshops are open, nothing's open. Other places, things have been open, they've been closed, they've been open. So it's in a different place. We still have an obligation to ensure the safety of our workers. So if you've had staff that are working, not working from home, but having to work in situ on site, you obviously need to kind of make sure that you're covering off your health and safety for essential workers while working. So social distancing, PPE, the personal protective equipment, vulnerable workers, and the right to refuse unsafe work. So those are the kinds of health and safety issues that we were chatting about. My understanding in chatting with the BookNet Canada folks, is that in most cases, we're dealing with offices with this cohort. There's some bookshops, and then you may eventually at some point we'll be back to having author events, launches, and stuff like that. But you're not running venues the way theaters are running venues. But the health and safety, you need to be looking at the health and safety of your workers. Then, of course, we get into the realm of if we have workers diagnosed with COVID or have the potential for contact, and how do we deal with that? And also for if they're exposed to family members or people that they're caring for. We know also job protected leaves is very much in the public conversation right now. And like a job protected leave. So job protected leaves, this is where it gets very complex very quickly. And again, you need to go to your jurisdiction. And there's one, I did bring up the link for it. There's one that just came up in the news 3 days ago. So this is a fast moving, fast changing realm. What job protected leaves are is, I think the biggest thing that when I'm talking to organizations is how are we handling time off right now? So if somebody needs time off because they're sick themselves, if somebody needs time off because they're caring for somebody with COVID, or they need time off because school has been open, closed, or you're either caregiving for somebody, all these COVID related. And each jurisdiction is going to have a suite of, in some cases, an organization might need to provide paid leave, but in a lot of cases, you may need to give them unpaid leave that's job protected. So meaning you don't need to pay them if they're not working, but so similar to a maternity leave, that's called a job protected unpaid leave. You don't need to pay them when they're on maternity leave or parental leave, but it's a job protected leave. So again, I'm starting to go down the rabbit hole where the specificity is going to be very, very different in different realms. But just again, for us to kind of think about the kinds of things you might need to be thinking about, the job protected leaves. Travel, this may not be the case for a while yet, but at some point we're going to need to think about if you have staff that are required to travel, if you've got artists or contractors that are required to travel, we're going to have some things that we need to think about from a legal point of view about visas and immigration issues. Right now, it's pretty simple because in a lot of cases, the outside of Canada borders are closed, but you might also be having it within Canada. Do you need your staff to be traveling, and what are the implications for that? Now, the other side is thinking about the human rights accommodation requests and making sure that any of the actions that you might take in terms of COVID response is not resulting in discrimination and not resulting in harassment. So meaning if something doesn't fall into the health and safety realm or job protected leaves, then is somebody going to ask for an accommodation to their work in order to deal with what's happening in the pandemic? Also, sticking with legal and personnel issues, but it's going to cross over when we talk about getting work done, is altering work arrangements. We've seen that, folks folks are all of a sudden are working from home, or because some folks have had to there's been a contraction of their staff and they've had to maybe do temporary layoffs or terminations or permanent layoffs, then we've got less people doing more work, and all of a sudden we're changing up, we're doing altered duties, and that might impact how you're dealing with that with your employee agreements and contracts. When we were kind of 2, 3, 4 months into this, we sort of thought this is temporary. We're now in year 2. We're at the beginning of year 2. So some of these longer term things might be something that you need to think about. In some cases, compensation changes have happened. So how are you dealing with that? Obviously, the very, very tough moves that some organizations have had to make with layoffs and terminations. And again, with leaves, infectious disease emergency leave, declared emergency leave. So these are all right. So this is the new one that just hit the news a couple days ago, the new Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. And I can pull the link if folks need to see it, but it's a new protected leave. And see, now I'm already going back down the rabbit hole. So it's very hard not to kind of want to start to talk about all the details, but you can see this is changing quite a bit. And then, of course, we saw early on for individuals, those applications for CERB, CRB, and then moving into EI, and then the wage subsidies, the CEWS, the CEWS, and possible recalls of staff, interest-free loans for business, rent subsidies. So there was a number of different things that come to play when we talk about legal personnel issues. So how do you stay on top of it? What I suggest is, in your local area, what I have seen is that a number of employment lawyers have set up COVID resource centers. Now, obviously, there are times when you're going to need to get paid legal expertise, and you probably have already done so. We're a year in. Anybody that's had to go through restructuring, the temporary layoffs, the what's sometimes being called permanent layoffs, depending on the jurisdiction, terminations, you may have already gotten legal expertise. Many law firms have a dedicated COVID resource center. Just make sure it's in your jurisdiction. So I've given you one example from BC and a couple examples from Ontario, but find one in your province or territory. And they will often have some pretty good resources, and they've been doing free webinars, and that might help. And then knowing when you need to pop in to get legal advice. The second bucket, again, is that getting work done. So we know things changed overnight. We had remote workplaces, and now we need to get work done in this new reality. And we're a year in. So in some ways, this conversation is we've already in it, and we did innovate very quickly, and we did it. The first point here is there's a couple things. Like, one is this first point is actually a sectoral conversation, and it may or may not be happening as much in your sector as it is in, say, live performing arts. But we have a sector that's waiting to be deployed. There's a number of folks that their livelihoods have been on hold, making art has been put on hold, and they are, their purpose and their raison d'etre of being artists is not in play. And you've got a highly skilled industry that have been out of work for almost a year. They might be finding out of sector to survive. And then on the other hand, we have what I keep calling the overwhelmed and the underutilized. So folks that still have jobs, and because of the wage subsidies, folks, in some cases, there's a lot of folks that they've been able to keep stuff on the payroll, but if you're not doing your regular volume of operations, there may or may not be things for them to do. And then the leaders generally, what I'm hearing, are overwhelmed. We were working on pretty razor thin margins pre-pandemic when it came to time, money, people, so many expectations, how much work we're getting done. And then you add the pandemic to it. And I think what's happening is that in the sector, you've got a bunch of folks that are now haven't worked in a year and are not kind of following their purpose. And also there's obviously the economic fallout of that. And then you have the folks that are working. You've got leaders that are overwhelmed and have been in crisis mode for over a year now. And then you have staff that have come back on wage subsidy programs with very different roles or not very much to do. So this is all a challenge. So, and then we look at offices. So the realities of the new arts office. So folks moved to remote workplaces overnight. And when you talked about the challenges, looking at how do we communicate, how do we get that same essence of, you might be able to find those ways to put in that structure of remote workplace, communicating to make decisions to get things done. But, on the one end, you can kind of find those ways to come together as teams, to make decisions, to get your to-do list done. But at the other end, how are you doing that correctly, standing in the middle of the hallway, cooking on a new idea, innovating, talking about the work, all that kind of thing that is more conducive to that in person. And then, of course, the social connectedness. Most folks, not everybody, but a lot of folks really like to have that connectedness. And we also need to kind of keep in mind, and I think this is going to be pretty obvious to everybody on this call. Everybody's home office experience is completely different. So some folks, they've got a dedicated home office, they've got lots of space, they've got really good internet, and some are looking after dependents of any kind. For some of them, home is a challenging place from a space point of view, from domestic situations. And so everybody's home office experience is different. So how do we even kind of look at the fairness of everybody's now is in their home office? What do we do? And, having those right tools and the right communication systems for what you need to get done. I do think now you're a year into this, so I think folks pivoted pretty quickly. But do you kind of need to look at, did we land on the right level of tools and communication systems? So are you doing weekly team meetings, cameras on? Do you let people have that privacy of not always cameras on? Are you doing phone calls? Are you doing one-on-ones? Are people using versions of Slack? Are they using online tools? What are the ways that you are communicating? Really kind of having a good look at that. Organizational capacity. This is something, again, I want to come back to, and I'm hearing this a lot across different artistic disciplines. How much can we actually get done? And again, unless you feel that your organization and sector, hasn't faced this, I feel like there's often that case of, let's do, deliver more for less and over deliver, and really kind of looking at how much hustle we do. And that's who we are. This is the work that we love to do, and doing more and doing better is often the drive and one of the drivers and motivators for what we do. But can we do that in a pandemic? Can we continue to get as much done? And for those on this call with boards, I think this is a really good chance to have a really open conversation with boards about expectations about how much you can get done in the current state. Do we look at doing less? And that has to be, this may not be something that you want to do in your organization, but I think in this new way of getting work done, we have to think about what is the capacity, just given all those things that I just talked about, which is, are staff members able to get as much done as normal? And it might be different according to their context. Leading and supporting. So this is a big one that, again, I think it's a really tough conversation to have about managing people and accountabilities within the pandemic. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this next week. But what's my job? What's my job now? So because we've had to do a contraction of staff, now there's lots of expectation on the folks that are remaining. The productivity expectations. Do we have the same expectations of our staff about how much work they get done? Are we all able to do that? And yourselves as well. Are we able to do as much hustle as we did before? And should we? And I feel like looking at conflict, and looking at the word conflict on its own is really just opposing views. And conflict can become very tough to deal with, or it can be like, do we have a mode of communication to work through differences in communication? And what I'm seeing in talking to clients and with orgs, some of that is really getting amplified and exacerbated in the pandemic, because there's an overall amount of stress on everybody on the planet right now, but also we've put a strain in terms of all of our communication on our communication structures, as well as depending on people's home lives. So how do you manage staying in touch with staff? The on-camera, off-camera conversation. How much communicating is the right amount? And how much do you stay transparent and accountable? And we'll have a little bit more time next week to talk on the communication side for you as leaders. But I think it's really something that we need to kind of think about for ourselves as well as for our staff. There's varying levels of stress for everybody. And again, the initial sprint became a couple of sprints, and then now it's a bunch of sprints that are a marathon of sprints. So we're still going. And so really recognizing that in yourself as well as for your staff. Now, I get it. You got to get stuff done. And the fact is, the other side of the balance sheet of this is staying whole, staying solvent, and finding those ways to kind of really quickly innovate, which then might mean asking people to hustle more, but maybe really kind of having a look at what is the impact of all that. On the employee wellness side, and this is another challenging thing to really kind of think about. When I'm doing HR advising with folks, I say to people, you are an employer, and so it's important to understand the lines and boundaries of an employer and employee, privacy, confidentiality, and you are their employer. We are a very team-based, cozy sector in some ways, and we can be very friendly and social. But once you're an employer, there is a line and there's boundaries. However, I am facing with the struggle myself about, do we keep those lines up in the middle of a pandemic? If you see somebody struggling, if you see somebody not managing things, whereas maybe you might kind of try to leave those boundaries up, now might not be the time. If you see somebody struggling, you might need to kind of cross those lines to kind of say, how are things going? So the reality of working from home is not normal for a lot of folks. And it is important for the senior leader to take care of their team and yourselves. This is the old, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before your team. If you have access to an EAP, an employee assistance program, or an employee wellness program, which I realize not everybody does, it's often an extension of a benefits program. So it's like a Morneau Chappelle. This can be a really good tool in your toolkit if it's accessible to you from a budget point of view. Because what an EAP does, anybody that has an EAP, it's looking at, they've got a 1-800 number to call with immediate support and private confidential counseling. Because I do think we can't be their counselors, we can't be their therapists, but I think we need to have our radar up a little bit more about how people are doing. And if you can find external access to some help, that's going to be an extension almost of your HR department. And also, again, locally in your province, if there's you look for your province's mental health 1-800 lines or telehealth lines, things like that. We know, it's same thing on the wellness point of view, physical health, staying active, eating healthy. Again, you might not think this is not our deal to kind of tell folks to do that, but you might find somewhere in that trying to keep the social connectedness with your staff, it might be like, hey, folks, reminder, just get out and walk around the block. Because I think we all know from research point of view, physical health, staying active, eating healthy are good physical ways to combat what's going on with the pandemic. And again, the social connectedness. So it might be back to those communication tools to get work done. You might allow, whether it's a happy hour, Zoom, although people might be like, oh my gosh, another Zoom, I don't want to go on another Zoom, but you might need to look at ways to deal with social connectedness. And this might be, if you've got other staff, hand it over to a staff member. Ask a group of folks like, hey, can you come up with some social things and allow, an hour and a half every couple of weeks to kind of do a Zoom session and somebody runs trivia. Like it might be, you need to find the right thing. What I just said might sound super fun to some folks and super corny to other folks. Find the thing that works for your organization. And that also might be a good way to engage other staff. Let them run with it. Because it's sometimes too, it's like the leader leading some of that stuff. It might be like, is this our enforced social time? Let somebody else run with it and just take that task off your plate. And obviously we know from an employee wellness point of view, understanding child and family commitments. And this is really tough because then you're like, well, so does that mean, am I really going to look at treating people differently according to their situations? And again, I think the rules during COVID is like, we need to think about that. You need to think about who really, and you also we can't guess who's handling things and being more resilient than others. So trying to find the fairest ways to kind of proceed through all of this. The ongoing impact, and then I'm going to pause for us to take some questions. You know, I think we do need to think long term. And there's some pieces that I think back to that Quill and Quire study in the survey about when people were asked about the health of their organization and their own, and this is pre-pandemic, about feeling, you know, feeling of connectedness, feeling like I'm stressed or snowed under, and feeling like I might need to be looking for another job. We need to think about the ongoing impact of the pandemic when it comes to everything that's happening. So, you know, organizations will be changed. We know this. So throughout your sector and throughout all sectors, some organizations will be stronger, some are weaker, none will remain the same. I think we have to acknowledge that things have changed. And so if we really need to sort of sit back and look at, do we need to do things differently? Now's the time to do that. We've had to, you know, there's been strategic risks taken and changing and innovating. There's been contingencies, there's been shutdowns. And then as a result, those jobs have been repurposed and revisioned to kind of bring that stability in those organizations. The one point that I really kind of want to bring forward, and again, not to kind of again go, yes, now Jeanne's telling us to do yet another thing. We need to think about how we are managing and dealing with our people right now. Because if, you know, for folks that have had to contract their workforce, and if, you know, we are able to gather again and we're ramping back up, people are going to remember how they were treated during the pandemic and how things rolled out. And I think it's very, very important that we really think about how we're managing our people in the midst of this. You know, even in the midst of having to make tough decisions, tough financial decisions, you can do it in a way that is respectful of people and with dignity. And people are going to remember how you manage your people systems. I think we're faced with this, and I'm hearing this from a lot of organizations, including those in this sector. I mean, I think we've seen people, you could have your office located in Toronto, and a lot of people have left the city, because if you're fully working remotely, people may have gone to where there's more space. They may have gone to live with families, so they may have left the province. For folks that are not currently employed, they may leave the sector. They may be making some decisions where, you know, for folks kind of like, well, I'm going to ride out the pandemic, you know, with family where there's lots of room and space, you know, not in Toronto, and just using that as an example. And so we need to understand, and we're seeing that, and we're going to really need to address how we kind of come back from that. So if we start to gather and have folks in the office, do we need to go fully back to being in person? Can there be some level of remote work? What do we want to do? And in all of this, some of the things I've been saying to you, we've had to really quickly retrain folks, and we've had to kind of, you know, do things on the fly. We might need to start to think about longer term professional development and succession plans. Maybe less the case, but, you know, especially with anybody that has interfaces with the public, we also need to have that health and safety lens about building audience confidence. So looking at what happens with our venues. Just a few more thoughts. You know your organization, you know your art, your craft, your sector. And I know that managing people can be rewarding and challenging. It's both. The good news is you have staff. The bad news is you have staff. Invest the time in your HR practices and develop the folks in your team. Especially, we heard a lot about challenges and turnover in your sector. So looking at how do you develop your team. And this is going to work out on the long run. What you really want is a highly committed, high performance team, and that are loyal to you, loyal to the organization. They do great work, and you hope that they stay with you for a long time. And looking at ways to kind of do all that, all of these things that I'm saying contribute to a really great place to work, where yes, you get all your work done, and also people love working there, but they're accountable and all that kind of good stuff. And we're going to really kind of dive in again next week on, we're going to talk about respectful workplaces and workplace harassment, but we're also going to look at some application of some scenarios.